Most of us are familiar with the passage in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, that tells us the basic definition of faith. The faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things that are not seen. Just prior to that, though, the writer of the Hebrew letter was talking to these Christians, these Hebrew Christians, who were struggling greatly with their faith. And so he wrote to them concerning the faith, and he gave them this encouragement. He said, "For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay, but my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls." Now, as we go on and read in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, we see example after example of those men of faith and those women of faith who did not shrink back, but who kept on in their faith, and because of that faith, God counted their faith as righteousness. Because, as we've seen the last couple of weeks, faith pleases God. This passage gives us a great warning that faith is not just something that I know, but it is about how I live my life. And he warns us that there is this great danger. I can actually shrink back. And the idea of shrink back in this passage means to withdraw from something. So I'm not wholly committed. I pull myself back from following God the way that I should. It says, if we do that, we'll be destroyed. The contrast, of course, is that the righteous one will live by faith. Isn't that the example we see with Abraham? That when Abraham was given those great promises, and he went to the land where he didn't know he was going, but he went anyway. He and Sarah waited for a long time to have the child that had been promised to them. They lived by faith. He said that preserves your soul. We also recall the statement in 2 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, verse 7, "For we walk by faith and not by sight." Today we want to talk about that walking by faith that we see in Abraham and the others in the 11th chapter. By the way, just as an aside, many people will use this passage, "We walk by faith and not by sight," and try to use it to contradict what faith is. Hebrews, the 11th chapter, verse 1 says, faith is the assurance, and some translations say substance, of things hoped for, and the conviction or the evidence or proof of things not seen. This passage, when it says we walk by faith and not by sight, is not saying that we're just guessing. We walk by faith, but that doesn't mean that we always see exactly what God has planned for us. In the passage that was read earlier, Matthew, the 14th chapter, we read about the time after Jesus had fed the 5,000. And it was already evening, you recall, when he had fed the 5,000. But after that event, he tells the disciples to get into a boat and they are to go to the other side of the sea while he dismisses the crowd and he goes up on a mountain to pray. By the time that he's done, the boat has been gone for a long time, but it's really struggling. The Sea of Galilee is not a very big sea. And yet, they were struggling because the waves and the wind was against them, and they were really struggling. They had not made it very far after hours of work. And in fact, we're told that when Jesus came to them in the fourth watch, and the fourth watch was between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So that tells us the disciples had been rowing their boat and not getting very far for a very long time. For hours, they were trying to get through those seas. And then Jesus comes to them walking on the water. That should astonish everyone, right? Jesus is walking on water, and I can't do that unless it's ice, and then I'm not very good at it. But he's actually walking in a storm on the water. The disciples look out and they see someone walking on the water and they're terrified. What do they think? It's a ghost. Why would they think it's a ghost? Because people don't walk on water. We are denser than water, so what is our propensity to do? We sink. And And that's what they would expect. So if someone's walking on, if they see someone walking on water, it must not be human. What else would they think? It must be a ghost. They were wrong. But they were terrified of ghosts, and they weren't getting very far. But Jesus, knowing the fear that they have, told them, "Take heart, it's I. Do not be afraid." Would that convince you? If you're out on that boat, struggling to make any headway at all, and you see someone walking on the water, and Jesus says, "Yeah, it's me. Don't worry about it. Don't be afraid." Would you be convinced? Would you stop being afraid? I'm not sure. I don't know how I would think about that. But it tells us something that they listened. And Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come out on the water." How many of you would have ever thought of that? If I'm in the boat, would you ever have thought, well, let me get out and walk with Jesus on the water in the storm? I think most of us would have been saying, well, hurry up, Jesus, and come join us in the boat, right? Get out of the water. But Peter wanted to be with Jesus. I have a little problem with Peter, even with this statement, because there's a part of me that says, what an incredible faith this is to say, I want to get out on the water and I want to be with you, Jesus. But did you notice the statement at the beginning? If it is you, there seems to be some doubt for Peter. Although he wants to be with Jesus, he wants some proof, some extraordinary evidence. And whenever we're asking for extraordinary evidence, there's a weakness of faith in those kind of statements. And Jesus says, "Come." Peter gets out of the boat, and he walks on the water, and he comes to Jesus. Wow, it's not just Jesus walking on the water, it's Peter walking on the water. We sometimes make fun of people who jump out of airplanes, even with parachutes. It's a perfectly good plane. Why are you jumping out of it, even though you have a parachute? What would you think of someone who would go out of a boat and try to walk on water in a storm? Well, that's crazy. That's insane. Who would do that? This is great faith by Peter. He says, this is Jesus, and I'm going to do what he says, and I'm so completely focused on Jesus that I trust him. If Jesus can do it, I can do it. Did Peter think he was doing it by his own strength? Did Peter think that there was something special about him that enabled him to walk on water suddenly? I don't think so. I think he was so completely focused on Jesus. I trust him completely. He was able to get out of that boat and walk in the water. And then he looked at the waves. And some of the manuscripts say the great waves. It wasn't just choppy water. There were great waves. He saw the wind and the waves, and he was afraid, and he began to sink. All of a sudden, that great faith was challenged by this I was going to say incredible fear, but it's really not incredible, is it? It's normal fear. That's what we would think, right? That the waves are going to knock me over. I'm going to be overwhelmed by the waves. This reel was not just something imagined. This wasn't Peter saying, well, there might be a boogeyman out there. He had a real reason to be afraid. And whenever we're walking by faith, there's going to be things that cause us to stumble. There's going to cause us things that cause us to look away from the trust that we have in God and be distracted by those things. And that's part of what we're going to be studying in our lesson. And Peter has that incredible fear. And so he cries out as he begins to sing, "Lord, save me." That's great faith. That's incredible faith at this point. When things become difficult and overwhelming, he still cried out to Jesus. He knew at that moment that his only hope really was Jesus. Do you know there's no if now? Before he said, if it is you, Lord, then command me to come out of the water. And now when he's out there in the water, he didn't say, if it is you, Lord, save me. He says, Lord, save me. He needed that help, and he needed it now. Lord, save me. Jesus reached out his hand, took him out of the water and said, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Why little faith? It's often been pointed out that of the 12 men in that boat, only one got out and walked on the water. We know that there was great faith when Peter did that. And I'm content there was great faith when he cried out, save me, also. There's trust, but there's fear. And so he began to sink. And this is the struggle I think that all of us face. It's the struggle that Peter faced all of his life. There's a reason I picked this series of pictures I found on the internet for pictures of Jesus. I know they're a little bit corny and not awesome or anything, but I saw this picture and I thought, that's perfect. Because whoever drew this, Jesus is kind of smiling when he reaches out and saves Peter. Have you ever thought about that? That Jesus would be smiling. Yes, he's rebuking him. Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? But it's the kind of thing parents do to their children all the time when a child doesn't behave or act exactly as they should. We understand that they're children. We understand that they're not thinking through things. We still smile. We still love them. Lord, save me. Jesus smiles and helps him up. Faith pleases God. Faith always pleases God. For someone to yell out, Lord, save me, shows great faith on his part. I love that smile. It taught me a lesson. And when they get into the boat, all of a sudden the seas are calm, and those who are in the boat worship him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. It's a great story. I think the example of Peter in this one story is typical of his life, and it's very typical of us also. That the walk of faith is not an easy walk. That it has many ups and it has many downs, and sometimes those come really quickly as we go through life. What is it that spurs me to keep on following after Jesus, to desire to be with him? Especially in difficult, improbable circumstances. What is it that keeps me following after him? And what are the stumbling blocks that I face? Understand by stumbling blocks, it's very real things. I'm not talking about imaginary things. The very real stumbling blocks that distract us from him, from following after him, from trusting in him as we should. So we're going to look fairly quickly, I hope, at some other examples in Peter's life. And we're going to see, I hope, that faith changes your life completely. It will change you completely in how you walk. So we're going to go back and remember what we were told by the writer of the Hebrew letter. The righteous, my righteous one, will live by faith. Live by faith and will preserve your soul. So let's go back all the way to the beginning of his relationship in Matthew, the 4th chapter, in verses 18 and 19. In Matthew, the 4th chapter, verses 18, 19, and 20, it says, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, talking about Jesus. Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Immediately, they left their nets and followed him. So here you have a fisherman. The fishermen who worked around the Sea of Galilee, at this point in time, we think that they were not very much above a poverty kind of class. They were people who worked day to day. So if I made money today, I fed my family today. It was grueling and hard work. And we know from the disciples that sometimes they would be up all night trying to fish. And we know Peter had responsibilities. He had his wife and his mother-in-law that he had to take care of. But here is this man who comes along and sees him fishing, a fisherman. He says, I want you to follow me. Follow me. And this faith is going to change Peter's life because he's going to go from being a fisherman, he says, I'll make you fishers of men. And they left it all and followed him. What a change in perspective for Peter. To go from the work of a daily life and just getting by to having an internal view of life. To go from a job where you're just catching fish to where you're going to be fishers of men. It's an incredible change that he wants him to make. In Luke, the 5th chapter, we can read about this incident a little bit differently when he calls his disciples. And in this case, Peter and his brothers and the fellow men were out on the boat and they were catching, well, they weren't catching fish. And Jesus said, well, put out in the deep and cast your net on the other side. And they did. And all these fish were in the nets. And so the boats were sinking. So they had to get the partners to come help them. Look at verse 8. Luke 5, verse 8. That when they saw the boats were sinking. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Depart from me, for I am a sinful man. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, and were the partners of Simon. Jesus said to Simon, Do not be afraid. From now on you'll be catching men. And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. As we've already seen, do not be afraid, something that Jesus has to say to us quite often. Fear is one of the great stumbling blocks we have for walking by faith. Do not fear. Peter, as he's walking on the water, he saw the waves. What happened? He feared, right? So he began to sink. Peter could have feared and said, well, what's going to happen when I leave my family, my wife and my mother-in-law, and I'm going to follow Jesus? He could have chosen not to and said, well, I've got other responsibilities I have to do. Later, we're going to see in Matthew the 26th chapter that when Jesus is being put on trial, Peter is outside around the fires, and 3 times he's challenged that you know Jesus of Nazareth. And what did Peter do? 3 times. He denied him. It doesn't say he was afraid, but isn't that what we probably think was happening? That Peter was afraid of saying that he was a friend, that he knew that he was a follower of this Jesus. Brothers and sisters, fear, no matter how strong our faith is, can cause us easily to stumble. I love, though, that he says they left everything. Don't be afraid. I'll make you catchers of men. So, okay. They left the boats, they left the nets, and they went and they followed after Jesus. And that's what God wants us to do. He wants us to truly follow after him. And that's what the walk of faith is about. In order to do this, though, they needed to see Jesus for who he really was. That Jesus was not just a man. That Jesus was not just another teacher, the kind that they were familiar with. And he was not just a prophet. There was something special about Jesus. Don't you see that in Luke the 5th chapter, verse 8? When Peter sees that great catch of fish, what does he say? Depart from me, for I am a sinful man. Peter understood that he didn't deserve to be in the presence of Jesus. There was something so special about him. We're going to see Peter make that recognition over and over again. In the 14th chapter, verse 33, after he had calmed the waves and they got back on the boat together with Peter, remember what it said? That all the disciples said, truly, you are the Son of God. Incredible miracles led them to say, he's not just a man. This is truly the Son of God. In Matthew the 16th chapter, verse 16, We'll see a time when, in that passage, in fact, you might want to go there. We'll be looking at that again soon. Jesus came to the disciples and he asked, "Who do men say that I am?" And they gave all kinds of answers. And he said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." For any Jew, saying Jesus is the Christ was a huge statement. The whole Old Testament was saying someone is coming, this one who's going to be the Christ, the anointed one, the chosen one. To say Jesus is the Christ is to say this is the one God has chosen for us, to save us from our sins, to make us a kingdom that will last forever. Peter saw something special in Jesus, didn't he? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. In John the 6th chapter, after the feeding of the 5,000, there were discussions among the Jews. And many of them didn't like what Jesus had to say about him being the bread of life. And many of them, because of this teaching that essentially said he was God, many of them stopped following him. So Matthew the 6th chapter, and in verse 68, it says, "After this, many of the disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. So Jesus said to the 12, 'Do you want to go away as well?'" What a change that would be, wouldn't it? That he would go from catching fish and following after Jesus, having left everything, and now Jesus turns to him and says, he gives him an out. "Do you want to leave also?" And listen to these words of faith by Peter. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." You are the Holy One. Isn't that incredible? Now, how did Peter know that Jesus is the Son of God, the Christ, the Holy One of God? Well, we see in these texts, it's because of the miracles that he did, the things that show that he was not just a man, but it was also, especially the last one, you have the words of eternal life. He knew who Jesus was because he learned from the miracles and from the words. Can we do the same thing today? Yes, absolutely. We still have recorded for us those incredible miracles that happened. We have recorded for us the words that Jesus said that show to us he truly is the Son of God. We can know. And that's why they left everything and they followed after Jesus, is because Peter said, "We have believed and we've come to know that this is who you are. You are the Holy One of God." But in Matthew 16, right after that incredible thing where he said, "You are the Christ, the Son of God," just immediately after that, beginning in verse 21, you can read that Jesus began to show his disciples that he would have to go to Jerusalem, that he was going to suffer many things, and that he would be killed. And on the third day, he would be raised from the dead. Verse 22 says, "And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him." So can you just picture that for a moment in your mind? The idea that Jesus is telling the disciples, "I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to be killed," and Peter says, "Come here, Jesus." That's not going to happen. Would you ever have the temerity to rebuke Jesus? And here's Peter doing it. He says, "Far be it from you, Lord. That should never happen to you." And do you recall what Jesus' reply was? He said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of men." He got rebuked right back, didn't he? "Get behind me." Jesus was saying to Peter, "You're being a stumbling block." And he called him Satan, adversary. He was not being a friend. He was not being a follower. He was opposing Jesus at that moment. Why is it that Peter said, "Far be it from you, this should never happen," that he would go to Jerusalem and be killed? I'm guessing it's ignorance. I'm not saying that he was ignorant of the fact. Jesus had just said it. He was ignorant of what was going to happen with the Messiah. All his life, he had been taught what was going to happen with the Messiah. When the Messiah comes, Israel will be a great nation, and they thought of it as being very much a physical nation, not a spiritual nation. And so if Jesus were to go to Jerusalem and he was going to die, what would happen to that kingdom? It's over. So out of ignorance, he was saying that'll never happen to you. And that's why he gives the perfect answer to this. You're setting your mind on the things of men. He was thinking of it not as God had taught, but as men had interpreted. Think about things the way God wants you to. So in this great moment where Peter could have shown faith, he almost stumbled, didn't he? You're the Christ, the Son of God, he said, the living God. But far be it from you, Lord. And he became a hindrance. Matthew, the 26th chapter. Jesus is talking to the disciples about the fact that he is not only about to be taken away, but Jesus tells them as they're eating the supper together that they are all going to betray him. He tells them, every one of you will betray me. And Peter says in Matthew 26, verse 33, Peter answered him, though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Jesus said to him, truly I tell you of this day. Sorry, let me start that first again. Jesus said to him, truly I tell you this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. But Peter said to him, even if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And all the disciples said the same. So this is not just Peter. All of them. What are they saying? I'm not going to fall away, and I'm not going to deny you. Do you hear the faith? Because I do. I hear a faith that says, I'm here to be with you, Jesus. I'm going to go with you all the way to the end. What's the problem with this faith at this point? It's based in a false pride. A pride that said that they had more strength than they thought they did. So here they are making that great statement, and yet they're going to fall away. In Luke, the 22nd chapter, we find out that Jesus had said a very special prayer just for Peter. Luke 22 and in verse 31. Luke 22, verse 31. Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Peter said to him, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny me 3 times that you know me. How awesome is it to think that our God prays for us? And he knew exactly what Peter was going to be facing, and he said, I've prayed for you that your faith will not fail. And then that you turn and help your brothers and strengthen them when you come back. Lord, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go and I'm ready to die with you, he says. They may all fall away, but I'm not going to. Peter has such confidence. But that pride is a trap for Peter. It's not the first time we've seen it. When Jesus was washing the feet of all the apostles, what did Peter say to Jesus? You'll never wash my feet. And Jesus said, if I don't wash you, I have no part of you. And over and over again, that pride is a problem for Peter. It's a problem for us. And so, of course, as Peter is out in the courtyard, people come to him 3 times and say, weren't you one of his followers? Weren't you with Jesus? And 3 times he denied him. And on the 3rd time, the rooster crowed. And Peter went out and wept bitterly because exactly what Jesus said would happen did. Did Peter's faith fail? With him denying Jesus 3 times, isn't there a part of us that says, well, that's a pretty obvious question, Dave? Of course, his faith failed. But I'm going to suggest no, it didn't. And this is why. Because he turned back. He came back to him. When he remembered Jesus, he wept. He went and he strengthened his brethren. Yes, he stumbled. There's no doubt that he was close at that point to shrinking back, to giving up, to not following him. But at that moment when the rooster crowed and he wept bitterly, he knew what he had done. He knew the pride that had said, I would never fall away. And now he had denied him 3 times, and he comes back, and he does what's right. Matthew, the 26th chapter, we see another problem the disciples had. They're in the Garden of Gethsemane, and there Jesus takes with him Peter, James, and John, and he says to them in the garden, he says, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. And watch means what? It means to be alert, to be helpful, to be praying for me. So if someone came to you, I don't care who they are, how well you know them, if someone comes to you and says, I'm so sad, almost to death, would you stay here while I go pray and be with me? Would you do it? Yeah. And Jesus goes off and he prays, Father, if it's possible, let this pass, but not as I will, but what you will. And he comes back to those men who he's asked, 3 special men, watch with me. And what are they doing? They're sleeping. Oh, that would be devastating to me. Wouldn't it be devastating to you? I just asked you, watch with me. This is tearing me apart. So he says to Peter, so couldn't you watch with me for 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And believe it or not, weariness sometimes is a great stumbling block to our faith. The fact that life is busy and life is hard and we've got a lot of things going on. And sometimes we become weary. And although there's a part of us that our spirit is strong, and I want to be up with Jesus, and I want to be watching with him and praying, and I want to be there for him, I fall asleep too. I fail to do things that maybe I should have been doing just because the flesh is weak. I get tired. Isn't this what walking by faith is about? In a very real sense, this almost defines what it means to be walking by faith. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Isn't that what happened with Peter, just as we just saw when he said, if all the others fall away, I will not. And if I have to go with you and die, I'll go with you and die, and I will never deny you. The spirit was willing, but when he was tested, the flesh was weak. We struggle so much with this faith. John, the 21st chapter. We see a last conversation between Peter and Jesus. And this is after Jesus has been raised from the dead and he's talking to his disciples. And he has a special conversation with Peter. We're not going to read all of it, but beginning in verse 15, it says, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, feed my lambs. and that conversation is repeated a couple more times with a little bit more intensity. But I want you to look with me down in verse 19. He said, this was to show what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, follow me. This is the struggle that we all have. Jesus says to us, do you love me? Yes, you know I love you. Feed my sheep. Take care. Do the work that I need you to do so that God's people can be what they need to be. Feed my sheep. Go on. And Jesus says, follow me. And then a few more verses down, there's John. And Peter, this is verse 21. Peter looks to Jesus and he says to him, Lord, what about this man? What about that guy over there? And Jesus said to him, if it's my will that he remains until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. And this is the last stumbling block that I think a lot of us struggle with. And that is that we make these comparisons with others. That we look at ourselves and we compare ourselves with others and we say, well, what about that person? What about that person? What about the preacher? What about the elder? What about this great man of faith? What about that person? And Jesus gives the perfect reply, doesn't he? What does it matter? You follow me. You follow me. The tense of that in the Greek is the one that means keep on following. You know, this is not just a one-time choice, but it's a you keep on following. And isn't that what we see in this walk of life? That's what it's really about, that it's about the keep on following. Yes, there's stumbling blocks. Yes, just like Peter, we're going to go through times when we face ignorance and pride and weariness. And we may stumble on those things. You keep following. This is the struggle each and every one of us has in the walk of faith. And the question that all of us have is, will you follow Jesus? Will you be like Peter? Jesus said to them right before, on the night that he was betrayed, he said, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Faith will change your life. Did it change Peter's life? I think it did. Jesus helped him to turn his mind away from the things of men and turn it to the mind of God. He changed it to focus on that which is eternal instead of just the day-to-day. He taught him to live by faith and walk by faith. And that doesn't mean that it was always perfect. But he kept on in that faith. So sometimes, yes, he said to Peter, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? There were struggles. Struggles are okay. It's okay. We need to be aware of those things that will make us stumble. But when your faith is little, when your faith is weak, when you're close to falling, when you do stumble, it's okay. Be like Peter. Keep going. Jesus didn't say, follow me and never stumble. Didn't say that to him. Peter shows us the right way, doesn't he? When he began to sink in that water, even though he was of a little faith because of the waves, what does he do? He comes back with, Lord, save me. And when you face these stumbling blocks in your life and you are struggling in your faith, what do you need to do? Look back to Jesus and say, Lord, save me. And he's going to be pleased with your faith. And he's going to reach out that hand and he's going to help you just like he helped Peter. And you might get a rebuke. You might get that reminder that you need to do better. But he's there for you. Lord, save me. Be careful that you don't shrink back, though. That's what the passage in Hebrews reminds us of. Don't shrink back away from God. Once you stumble, don't keep going further back down that road. Quitting doesn't please God. So you follow me. That's the invitation that we have for everyone this morning. You follow me. This day, today, if you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, if you understand that He is the Holy One that has come to save you, if you believe and you're ready to repent, which means to leave away the things of men and follow after the mind of God, if you're ready to follow Him, this morning you can be baptized. We have the water ready, and you can have your sins washed away, and you can be a follower of Jesus. And don't expect, when we say being a follower of Jesus, that you have to be perfect the rest of your life. When you stumble, there's a solution. We can still call out to Him, Lord, save me. Perhaps you're a brother or a sister who needs our encouragement because you're struggling with your faith. You're struggling in the walk of life. If you need our prayers, if you need our help, for either reason, please come forward as we stand and sing.